Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Chag Sameach. Um, this is the first Tikkun we all, at least I'm sure for some people, the first Tikkun that I'm doing it through Zoom in in my own home. So right, it's a Shechianu moment as well, I guess, which sort of I wish we were all together. But one of the blessings of this is that I'm sure there's a lot of people who otherwise would not be able to join and are able to join now. So we have to look at both sides of this. Yes, thank you for that introduction. In fact, indeed, I am the founding rabbi of the Tshuva Center, which is a center here in New York that we're building for creating an intentional spiritual recovery community for people who are dealing with addictions, with all sorts of different addictions. In many ways, addiction is a general term that refers to all the things that stop you from being the best version of yourself. And for some, of course, this is alcohol and drugs and gambling and sex. But addiction is so much larger than that in many ways. And part of what we're going to look at today in some texts and some of our outlooks about what it looks like, what recovery looks like, what spirituality looks like for us, and for people who are really willing to look themselves in the mirror. In many ways, spirituality for people in recovery, but I think uh, one of the founders of the people at Betshuva sort of often says that you don't have to be an addict to be in recovery, which is true. The slightly more egregious way of saying it sometimes just is like you're either in recovery or you're in denial. So I don't know that that's exactly true for everybody, but definitely sort of part of what we're learning and part of what we're seeing. And one of the reasons of teaching classes like this is to benefit from what we learn from people in recovery in terms of what spirituality and what recovery can tell us about everyday life for all of us. In that sense, I think these days with COVID-19, all of us are feeling things that most people in recovery feel all the time, which is a lot of anxiety and stress and fear of the unknown. And so I think a lot of us can relate at least to sort of to a lot of these feelings and a lot of what we're going through in that sense. Uh, uh, I'll start by I guess by saying that addiction, and we have to sort of look at that just as a frame for this. Addiction almost always starts as a solution to a problem. Almost always, people who get to be in recovery start their track of addiction in a space where they need to solve a problem. It's that drink before the party to loosen things up. It's that the drugs or the alcohol to sort of make us feel more sociable, not as awkward. For some people, I'm always struck by a conversation I had with a young girl that sort of came to work with us, who was describing the first time after being in the depths of heroin and describing sort of the traumas of her childhood. She unfortunately was abused, sexually abused. That the first time she used heroin, she felt free. She felt that all the trauma and abuse that she had went away, and she felt that sort of this was amazing for her because all of a sudden she felt like what she thought everybody else feels. And in that sense, sort of course, she would be like, why wouldn't I try this more? And the more you do it, the more dose you need. And the more dose you need, the more you chase the high, the more chase the high, the more you lose control, the more you lose control, the more you lose control of your whole life. And trying to figure out ways to sort of help people who are really in the depths of addiction, people who are in the depths of despair, people who are in the depths of anxiety, is kind of what we do. And part of what we're going to look at some text today is sort of how do we use that? How do we acknowledge our brokenness and how do we move forward? And in that sense, Jewish text has enormous amounts of what to say and to help us deal with those elements. So that's sort of like a rather large intro. Yeah, if you, I guess, sort of, Rabbi, if people want to just write in their chats questions, sort of I can try and get to them. I can see the chat, but if not, at least I can see the end. We'll also leave some time for direct questions, sort of with sort of open microphone, so we can do that as well. The only thing I need is for you to allow me to share my screen so that I can show some text. Um, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. So I don't know if there's any questions or comments before we start, just sort of to frame. If you do have one, if you want to go on mic, you can put your hand or you can write into the chat, and we can do that for a minute or two before there is. But if not, we can just jump into the text. Cool. Okay. I guess we'll just jump into the text. Great. Yeah. All right. So let me share the screen with you. So the first sort of text that I wanted to sort of show you and sort of kind of discuss with you guys is this one, which is a poem. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. The initial part for us, for me, is looking at our brokenness, not as a weakness, not as something that we have to hide, not as something that we have to fear, but something that allows us to really be open to the world. For those of you who are music fans, were sort of like, I always think about Leonard Cohen in those moments, right? Sort of like who attributed then sort of this to Rumi. It's not Rumi, fine, but right, so like the cracks, that's how the light gets in. That is sort of our brokenness is in fact the first element that we sort of work with in terms of people in recovery and people who are suffering, to understand that without the brokenness, we cannot be open to the rest of the world. And in many ways, Mary Oliver's poem has always sort of resonated with me in that we ought to try and connect to our brokenness. We ought to try and be open about our brokenness. That in fact, people who are not broken have very hard time connecting to then people who are around them. That the brokenness allows us in a very distinct way to connect to the world. It opens us up and it opens other people up. The next text, or sort of like really the big text that I want to look at, is from Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, who's a Zionistic rabbi from the beginning. Was the first rabbi of official rabbi of Israel, and he talks about tshuva, right? And we talk about tshuva, we talk about a way of life. We'll discuss this in a second, but a way of life and a way of looking at the world through three elements of tshuva, which is repentance, which most people know from Yom Kippur and the like, and then of course return, which is also a meaning of the word tshuva, and the response, which is the third definition of the word tshuva. So living in a state of response, a return to oneself or return to a previous self, and then of course repentance, are all intertwined with each other. So he writes the following: Tshuva precedes creation. Therefore, it is the foundation of the world. The perfection of life comes precisely with the ongoing process of life's self-revelation in accordance with its essential nature. Since nature intrinsically cannot perceive and differentiate, from that aspect, sin is inevitable. There is no righteous person in the world who does good and never sins. But a person's elimination of the essential nature of life so that he will be sinless is in itself the greatest sin. Thus, the verse states, the Kohen will gain atonement for the Nazarite who had sinned himself. Therefore, Tshuva rectifies the damage and brings the world and life back to its source precisely through the revelation of the foundation of life's supreme essence, which is the world of freedom. And therefore, we refer to Hashem as God of life. I don't know if anybody has some comments or thoughts or about this. How does it strike everybody? If you want to say something, again, you feel free to chat or to sort of raise your hand and we can call on you. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Rabbi Gurin, I just want to let you know we can't. You might be able to see the chat, but generally we won't be able to see those features with the screen share. At least I have a hard time. But maybe
Got it. Okay, fine.
maybe you know better than I do.
Yeah. So I guess if you want to raise your hand or say something at this point is also good.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Rachel Sherman, hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I have a question, just sort of thinking about sort of tshuva as this idea that it precedes creation, but thinking about sort of Judaism and the way we experience it now, it seems like we sort of lump tshuva into a season of like doing tshuva around Yom Kippur, so sort of the idea that it has always existed. I guess sort of I'd love to hear your thoughts on why we feel like it is now sort of segmented into a specific sort of experience in terms of the way we view Judaism. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And in fact, I'll show you in a few seconds. I'll show you in a few minutes. I'll show you a different sort of text about tshuva. But one of the questions I think that we all have to ask, which I don't have a specific answer to, but is exactly that. So like that we've somehow have taken a process that should be a daily process, a way to look at our own brokenness, if you will, on a day-to-day basis, and created something that sort of like we almost reserved towards Yom Kippur, the reserve towards a segment of the year. And again, I think that it is part of this little soapbox sort of that we're on in terms of the Tshuva Center. And what I'm trying to say is that we, in general, many of us try to hide our brokenness. A lot of us are trying to pretend that everything is okay, that that we don't have really a lot sort of vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities become a weakness, and that we don't celebrate the achievements of everyday life in the same way that sort of we achieve things of status, and that we are afraid to show it, right? The sort of what we call the Shonda factor, right? So that we don't want to sort of talk about those things. Scott Mendelson raised his hand.
Hi, thank you. It's interesting, this idea of teshuvah preceding creation, which kind of messes with my head a little bit. One way I can understand it is both in 12-step, but also in particularly at my marriage. I've had this experience, 12-step has this principle of one day at a time. And even when you're counting days, you both count the duration, but it's also one day at a time, and that's all that matters. And that is in our Jewish life in terms of the weekly cycle of Shabbat, the weekly cycle of daily prayer, even if we just get up and say, I'm awake, the sets of prayers that go with that. And then with my wedding, I had a fascinating experience getting married in my 40s with people from different parts of both my and my husband's lives. There was this sense of collapse, like the people I knew from high school and the people I've just met. There was like every moment was available in my memory and my experience. And there was something about the chuppah and this sort of collapse into this is my death moment as we're wearing our what's the word? Kittles, thank you. As we're wearing our kittles, and there's growing up and not being raised Jewish and having come to it later, and yet my bar mitzvah in my 40s feels like it's stretched back, and I remember my life differently for it. So there's something about spiritual time and holy time versus this struggle material time in that. But I was interested to hear how you understand teshuvah preceding creation.
Right. So it's funny you say that, because the teshuvah also has a whole section about time and what physics is now calling retrocausality, but that's a whole different thing in quantum physics. I'm a big quantum physics person. So, but in the sense that when Cook talks about preceding creation, is that when God gives us tshuva, it means that he acknowledges that we are built with the mechanism to what we call sin. Although again, sin, because in English it's really more Christian, right? The Hebrew word is chet, which means to miss the mark, right? So for God, and in terms of tshuva, that God said, like the text says, that if you think that you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to be perfect, I'm going to do this perfectly, I'm going to be a good boy or a good girl, and I'm going to do my best at this, and I'm not going to sin, you are in fact basically telling God and telling creation, you know what? No, I know that the instruction says I'm going to have some shadow, I'm going to have to have some brokenness, but I don't believe that. So, like, you know, God, I don't think you know what you're talking about. I'm just going to be good. And what Cook says in terms of tshuva is saying, like, no, dude, that's not how it works. Sin is part of life. Brokenness is part of life. Darkness, I'll show you in a minute, is part of life. And in that sense, God is giving us tshuva because he says, I know you're going to sin, but I'm also going to give you a path on how to learn from that sin, and how to learn from what you're doing, how to learn from your brokenness. And if you're going to pretend that it's all going to be good, you're not going to use tshuva. And in fact, you're not going to use the real tool that I'm going to give you. So in that sense, sort of precedes creation, because he knew that that's how we're built. And in fact, right, and I'm sort of like kind of tipping my head, but in fact, a huge part of the brokenness and spirituality is for us to acknowledge that we have a shadow self and a higher self, and that we have to constantly be in that space to encompass both, right? And that's really, really important. What we call if you will, a kind of corpus callosum, right? Kind of the bridge, right? The corpus callosum of bringing everything together. And in fact, broken people or people in recovery, people who do things, are people who live in a split. People who try to sort of separate different parts of themselves and not putting them together. Okay. I'll show you some of the next text. I mean, some of the comments. Yes, I know the work of Brene Brown. Absolutely. Yes, we do live in a 10th step pretty much every day. That's pretty much what we do. Right. So here's the Hebrew for that, whatever. Right. Here's an interesting text from Bereshit Rabbah, right? From text. It says, right, Rabbi Nachman said to Rabbi Shmuel's name, behold, it was good, right? Refers to the good desire, right? We're talking about Genesis. We're talking about creation, right? Hinet tov meod, right? This is Yetzer HaTov, right? The good inclination, right? What we call the Yetzer HaTov. And then after it says, behold, it was very good, the Midrash says refers to the evil desire, right? Because it only says very good after man was created with both good and bad inclination. In all other cases, it only says God saw it was good, right? So the Midrash then says, can then the evil desire be good? What are you talking about? This Yetzer Hara, is that really good? How can that be really good, right? All our lives, we learn that this is really bad, right? There's Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination, and Yetzer Hara, the bad inclination, right? The text says, the Midrash says, that would be extraordinary. But without the evil desire, without the evil inclination, however, no man would build a house, take a wife, beget children. And thus said Solomon, again, I consider all labor and all excelling in work. That is man's rivalry with his neighbor. The text here, right, sort of starts to illustrate for us something that's even deeper than what we were just talking about in terms of tshuva, is that there is the Yetzer HaTov, and then Yetzer Hara as we know them, right? And we are, again, influenced by a lot of Christian mythology that sort of like has this like little angel on your side, right? This sort of on one side, and then the devil on the other side, and they keep whispering in your ear, right? Good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. But that is what the Midrash is saying, like, nah, even the evil, quote unquote, inclination, you need it. There is this great Midrash in Talmud, which is of like, it's very long, so I didn't want to bring it to that, but like how the people of Israel, whatever, they decide to capture the evil inclination. God sends him a sign, says, throws him a piece of note from the sky, gives him a sign. They catch the evil inclination and they put it in this lead cauldron and they put a cap on it. And the next day they said they want to look for a fresh egg for the sick, and they can't find a fresh egg. without the quote unquote evil inclination, without the darker side, without the lust, without all the things that we think, oh, I'm just going to be good, I'm not going to throw all these stuff away, we are stuck in a world that has no creation, no art, no new life, no houses, no marriage. In many ways, I personally refute this translation of Yetzer HaTov, Tov being good, and Yetzer Hara, and I bring it from what sort of the end of the pasuk, the end of the drash, to sort of that Solomon brings, which is right the rivalry, mere'ehu, ki kinat hi mere'ehu, because Yetzer Tov is Tov, Yetzer Ra we translate as bad, but if you take away the punctuation, Reish Ain Ra, Ra is not just evil. Ra is also, anybody who's getting married in a Jewish ceremony should at least recognize the word. From Sheva Brachot, Re'im Ovim. Rea is a friend. A Rea is a counterpart. A Rea is Re'ut Chaverim. That's right, Chaver. Thank you, Inbal. Right? So if there's Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer HaRea, it is not the evil inclination. There is the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination, and then the other one, his friend, his counterpart. And in many ways, there's only one, there's Yetzer. And the Tov Ra is what we sort of bring into it. And that's why there's no such thing as Yetzer Ra. And that's what the Midrash tells us. That Yetzer Ra is not something that we should be afraid of, because otherwise, if we negate that, there will be no marriages, no new houses, no new buildings. And for us, again, both in terms of recovery, but I think also in modern day spirituality and in just regular people who want to sort of look at their lives, we have to look at both parts. And we have to amalgamate them into one, or at least sort of to integrate them into one element, and which is the self. And by doing so, we are able to sort of start bringing more peace with it. Any comments or questions at this stage before we move on to some other cool texts? Again, raise your hand.
This is Scott. I just wanted to say that the AA Big Book talks about our addictions being our normal instincts out of proportion or misused. And of course, proportion implies relationship.
Wait, I saw you, Anna, just a second. You can raise your hand. Yeah, yes, go on, Scott.
Oh, sorry. So if it's sort of about normal instincts just out of balance or run amok, our addiction is a normal thing that's out of control. And there's something in here about balance. You can't have balance unless it's in relationship. So the good and the evil instinct are really two sides that in their right place are our strengths together. Without one or the other, things get out of balance and we end up in trouble.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny because balance always only happens in motion, a little bit like a bicycle or motorcycle. In many ways, I think that's why halacha is called halacha. It's kind of a walking, it's kind of a movement, but that's a whole other thing, a whole other drash. But yes, and in Judaism, we have a lot of that. So that we have the midot, right? It's sort of like too much of one midah is some one thing and one other. Anna Wider blank. You're muted. Wait, I have to unmute you or something.
Yeah. I was gonna say that you mentioned earlier in passing that the AA model it focuses on the split nature. I'm echoing the point that was made before, but it seems to me that there's an inherent contradiction in going with that model with split nature and also striving for integration. And so I wonder how you resolve those two ideas.
Wait, say that again. The contradiction is between one and what?
It seems to me that there is there's a contradiction between the idea of a split nature and you're choosing to go with your angel or your better side or your better instincts, over the addiction, and that seems contradictory to the idea that what we're striving for is integration.
Right, got it. Yes, what we're striving for integration is because in addiction, all kinds of addiction, again, not just sort of the big ones, that we are striving for in terms of what we do at Tshuva Center, but I would say in general, in terms of what I believe to be true that we should be doing, is we have to strive to recognize, to first bring to awareness, but to recognize the different parts of the self, which are the light self, shadow self, Yetzer Tov, Yetzer, all these things, right? And then find, right, again, this sort of this corpus callosum, find the bridges between them, find where they are. That is sort of that we have to acknowledge, right, just like sort of in that sense Cook says, that sort of there are parts of ourselves that are drawn to the shadow. And we have to both acknowledge it and then find ways to use it, or find ways to sort of to acknowledge it in a way that allows us to perhaps not be afraid of it, right? To say, right, to be ability, although it's so much easier today, right, to say I am anxious, or right, or when something like this happens, I feel I have no control, or right, I overeat, or I overspend, or right, or here's something that I'm trying to do, right, and in that sense, right, I long for the day, right, that sort of that most shuls, the same way that they announce how, like, you know, Moshe got into Harvard and whatever, and like, you know, the Schwartzes just had a baby boy, that we'll also be able to celebrate how Johnny just took, you know, just has been a year sober, right, or right, sort of like those elements, right, that sort of we really don't integrate, both in terms of communal space, but definitely in terms of a individual space, is because we are driven by also many other things of like shame and guilt, which is sort of a lot more to talk about. But I think that they go together, because acknowledging different parts of the broken does not make it separate. That means that we get a chance to then be aware of it and then bring them together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
I am sort of new to recovery, not new to therapy and mental health, but new to recovery, and there's a lot of things I don't understand about it yet. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Other comments, if there's anyone? Okay. All right. There's a request for me to show the poem again. I'm going to show the poem again, and then Rob Klein had a raised hand. Yes, Rob.
Good evening. Thank you. This has really been already insightful, and I know we still have a lot of time left. I really appreciate what you were just talking about, because it's really one of my greatest struggles right now. I came into recovery in New York City, and also paralleling that was as a young adult getting involved in my Jewish journey on the Upper West Side at BJ and Ramamu, and I find it really challenging to find a community that speaks this language, that really talks about and teaches Judaism in a transformative practice. My recovery, and I've been in recovery for 17 years, and it totally blew the doors off of my spiritual practice. My, you know, going to a BJ on a Friday night, or really immersing myself in the holidays, which you know, growing up in a Jewish home, I called it a part-time conservative suburban experience, where, you know, like we went through the motions, and I called, you know, the big four: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, Pesach. You know, I just finished the experience of counting the Omer, you know, using a daily reflections book, and like the transformative experience of daily prayer, of Shabbat, of the holidays, is not something that I find easily in community. I've been in New Jersey I grew up here, but I've been in New Jersey for 10 years. A wife, 2 kids, and I'm very adrift out here without a connection to a community that both can embrace the global idea of you know, moving from slavery to freedom, you know, dealing with addiction, as you said, you know, we're all addicted. We're all like struggling with this separation and this split. And so, you know, that's just something I wanted to share, is that, you know, in recovery as a Jewish person trying to raise a Jewish family, there's just, you know, there's not a lot of depth to how communities pray and talk about it, and particularly as a man, like finding other men who can talk spiritually Jewishly.
Right. So thank you for that. First of all, feel free to email me and talk, and you can join us. So that's what we're building in New York. We're building a community of Jewish life. I guess I didn't say this, maybe what I should have, right? That one of the big challenges of recovery in general for people in addiction, but I think in general, is that sort of if you want to, let's say you want to go to an AA meeting, most AA meetings, at least in the city, happening at church. That is sort of, you have to go, right? The church there's a cross on the wall, you have to deal with that. And all that, and that's very difficult. And the second part is that, and I do think, and that is a slight criticism, and I think a lot of people have sacrificed meaning for ritual. They've sacrificed sort of community for events. That is sort of like our ability to connect is hampered by the fact that sort of we want everything to be a lot prettier than it is. And again, this is not for everybody. There's a lot of communities who do a lot of great things, right? So like from all sorts of things, I've been speaking in everything from KJ to you know, to other places. So there's a lot of sort of more and more openness to it. But it's true that sort of, again, that our ability to talk to the rabbis, to talk to each other, to really bring our own brokenness to the forefront is not something that happens very often. It does happen here and there, but it doesn't happen very often. And part of my job, if you will, part of what I'm doing by doing this and other things, is really to be the guy, to be the person, to be the group, to be the synagogue, to be the community that says this sort of like, not only do I want people to sort of bring the Jewish life, but the Jewish life, right? And not just religious life, the Jewish life, cultural Jewish life, spiritual Jewish life has a lot to teach us about recovery and about finding meaning in life and building meaning in life, right? And creating meaning. I just did, like an hour ago, I did this whole talk with George Haas from Meta Group, right? We talk about sort of Judaism and Buddhism, and for them as well, in terms of the spiritual practice, the goal is to find meaning. And I think a lot of us have lost our ability to find meaning. A lot of people, right? One of the most toxic sentences in the English language, in my opinion, is, I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when I get a car. I'll be happy when I get married. I'll be happy when I have children. I'll be happy when I have my promotion, when I have boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. And we've relinquished our happiness to an external source rather than an internal source. And when we are able to find our own spirituality within ourselves and to really go deep into our own brokenness, that's somewhere that sort of gives us a lot of strength. I want to sort of go back, right? So by the way, for the person, I think it was Inbal who wanted the poem. Here's the poem again. You can see it. I'm happy to send it out afterwards as well. All the commercials.
Oh.
Sorry? Okay.
No, go back.
So I can't tell who's talking.
I just wanted to see the poem again.
Oh, there you go. Okay. All right. So let me then continue with what I want us to learn. I'll go back to the Talmud in a minute, but here's a text, right, which is sort of illustrates a little bit of what I wanted to say about this. This is from one of my old teachers, Yosef B. Soloveitchik, right, out of the yeshiva, right. Here we go. As a rule, in times of joy and elation, one finds God's footsteps in the majesty and grandeur of the cosmos, in its vastness and its stupendous dynamics. When man is drunk with life, when he feels that living is a dignified affair, then man beholds God in infinity. In moments of ecstasy, God addresses himself to man through the twinkling stars and the roar of the endlessly distant heavens. Or Lord my God, thou art very great, thou art clothed with glory and majesty. In such moments, Majestas Dei, which not even the vast universe is large enough to accommodate, addresses itself to happy man. However, with the arrival of the dark night of the soul, in moments of agony and black despair, when living becomes ugly and absurd, plainly nauseating, when man loses his sense of beauty and majesty, God addresses him, not from infinity, but from the infinitesimal, not from the vast stretches of the universe, but from a single spot in the darkness in which surrounds suffering man, from within the black despair itself. God in those moments appeared not as an exalted, majestic king, but rather as humble, close friend, brother, father. In such moments of black despair, he was not far from me. He was right there in the dark room. I felt his warm hand, kivyachol, as if on my shoulder. I hugged his knees, kivyachol, as if. He was with me in the narrow confines of a small room, taking up no space at all. God's abiding in fenced-in finite locus manifests his humility and love for man. In such moments, humilitas Dei, which resides in the humblest and tiniest of places, addresses itself to man. I'll leave it up for a second for people to kind of review and say, if I don't know if anybody has a comment or reaction. Right, for Soloveitchik and for me, and especially in this moment, both in terms of this moment in time, but in terms of learning about recovery and about spirituality in recovery and spirituality in brokenness, is that we often, again, relinquish God to one side or another, right? That a lot of people, right? So like, I'm a bit of a freak in that sense. Like a lot of people sort of go to the Grand Canyon and see like, oh my God, this is like amazing. This is the vastness, right? The Grand Canyon of life, right? And see, sort of get inspired. I'm one of those freaks of like, it's a big hole in the floor. I don't get it, right? But on the other hand, for me, right? So like driving back to New York from Brooklyn and seeing the skyline can bring me to tears, right? So for different people have different things where sort of like God, right, appears to them in the majesty of all things, right, in the beauty of all things, and right, and it's easy to see God in that sense. He says in Happy Man. But what happens in those moments, as he describes, which so many of us go through, moments of real despair, moments of blackness, moments of nauseating pain, where in that sense is God in there, right? And in that thing, right, and the text was written in the turn of the century, so it's a little bit sexist. You'll forgive me, I hope, or Soloveitchik for that, right? Is in those moments of father, mother, brother, sister, partner, whatever. That part of the spiritual element is to make sure that God is in the infinitesimal as well. That in those moments, we have to find, right, where our spirit sees the same thing it sees when we are in an expansive state. Some comments in that sense. The dichotomous nature of God being everywhere, but also being the source of closest person. Yes, absolute relationship. Our majesty can be easy, intimacy is harder. Amen to that. I think this particularly resonates now in this time when we are profoundly lonely, and I wonder what godness, where's godness or goodness in my depression and recovery. That's the thing. I think that one of the amazing things, and this is in many ways the core of a lot of what we do, is the opposite of addiction is not recovery. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That when we connect to people, when we connect to community, that's where recovery is. And in that sense, both for Soloveitchik and for everything else we were saying, but for Soloveitchik is, where is God? God is in the brother, in the father, in the sister, in that moment, in the infinitesimal. Because if we are in fact built B'Tselem, if God created us B'Tselem, if we are a reflection of God, then every time you talk to another person, you're talking to God. And whenever God talks to you, he's talking through a person. That when a friend, a brother, when you have something that connects, that comes in, right? Then you are able to, no, it's Yohan Hari. Then you are able to connect to people. You're able to sort of see yourself within the scope of a larger system. And when you are able to do so, right, you are able to get better. But you're only able to do so out of brokenness. Perfection is boring. Success is boring. People that you connect to, if you think about your life, people that you connect to is people that come and you look you in the eye and say like, hey, I've gone through A, B, C. People right now say like, I am anxious. Oh, I am anxious too. I'm lonely. Oh, I know what lonely is. Because the human condition, right, tells us that we are all experiencing the same thing. And that is not more, it's never been more true than these days. That right now in the Tikkuns, right, we're in the Tikkun here, the Tikkuns all over the world. But whether I talk to somebody in Berlin or Tel Aviv or Buenos Aires, everybody has felt what all of us have felt for the last 3 months or so. Loneliness, anxiety, unknown, fear. And it's only then that we can able to connect. If we don't express the brokenness, if we don't acknowledge our brokenness, if every time somebody asks us, how are you? And you say, okay, there's no connection. And if there's no connection, there's no healing. If there's no healing, you suffer alone. Yes, some comments. Right, is that Gababat? No, it's Yohan Hari. Yes, the opposite of addiction is connection. Yesod carries both that dark and light energy, not just Yesod, all of it, right? The entire tree carries it all together. It is both the sides, right? Every satra has satra achra. Like there's just, that's how it's built. Yeah. Comments, thoughts, questions, raise your hand.
I just want to show the text, the idea of sort of this image of someone hugging someone's knees, or it just seems so lonely. I think like that, it really just like epitomizes that like loneliness and how it's like a deeply personal relationship. I have a sibling that is recovering from addiction. So again, trying to sort of understand his pain as someone who was on the outside of that. And I think for me, just like that idea of connection, I really, really loved what you said about the idea of, you know, connection being the goal versus recovery, and saying that like connection definitely seems like it has more roots and permanence rather than recovery, which is also another isolating term that is just for him and not necessarily like a communal experience, which is sort of the healing factor there.
Correct. And I would say even more so that sort of recovery, right, sort of can be a very sort of quantifiable things, right? So like I've been, right, whatever, like sober X amount, but more importantly, both in terms of the knee, and we learned this from Parker Palmer, is that we can't help others in many ways when they are suffering. What we can do is create a space to be them. And that's, as I see the knee, is sort of like almost like, right, sitting somebody next to somebody knee to knee, the knees are touching, right? And the knees are touching. And again, for me, it evokes this idea of the Kruvim, of the two angels at the top of the ark that sort of look at each other, right? And there's a great midrash that says that when God is pleased with the people of Israel, the Kruvim at the top of the ark look each other in the eye. But when God is displeased with the people of Israel, the Kruvim look down. They don't look each other in the eye, right? And it's a little bit like I know people know, but like the emblem in the middle of the Oval Office can change. So when when in America's in time of war, the emblem has different parts of the carpet that keep going in and out, a little bit like a floor tile system. But in the same way of the Kruvim on the ark, and in terms of our connection, the sort of connection allows us to relate, and that is something that is on both parties and on us and others. But that's also true, by the way, for community, because I think as a community, as a Jewish community, we have to be in recovery. We have to go into recovery, because quite frankly, I think as a community, we've done an abysmal job at addressing the needs of our community, right? And looking at what we've done in terms of, definitely in terms of recovery in opioid epidemics, to sort of like, it's unbelievable. And I still have rabbis who say to me, right, I have a rabbi who has a very prominent place in the shul who said like, oh, this is not a problem for us. And I'm like, what? No, right? And there's still a lot of people who say like, I can't come out with this, right? This will destroy my family, so forth and so on. Kim, did you have your hand up? Somebody had a hand up.
I'm just going to jump in and give you the 5-minute warning so that we can close
Oh,
up.
thank you, Rabbi. I thought I saw a hand, but okay, never mind then. Is there another hand?
I have a question. I have
Yes,
my hand
go ahead.
up. Yeah. So I was just wondering, in terms of Judaism and everything, so, the idea that if they say, I'm reading from Amuna right now.com. It's all from Hashem. There's purpose. Hashem is my father. He loves me. It must be good, my ultimate best. Now that your heart is calm, your mind can think and ask, what is the message Hashem is sending me? So I don't really get it. And the idea that, to pray to God to protect us. But what about the people that died with COVID? I don't get that, this philosophy with that. And Hashem wasn't protecting them, or, I don't get it.
Well, I agree with you in that sense. And that's why, for me, both prayer and in terms of all these things of spirituality, it is our outlook on life, right? Hashem has not spoken to me directly in quite some time, right? So I can't speak of that, right? But, right, what I can do, right, and I'll say something slightly controversial, and I apologize for that, right? But as a rabbi, as a person on my own little soapbox, right, my clients, people know that my view is that God doesn't care. If I'm harsher and kind of like God doesn't give a shit at all. But the other part of that is God doesn't care, and therefore I must. If God has no ability or no willing at this point to show his face and whatever, and the world is the way it is, the only thing that's left is for me to do my best to find that connection. So I don't look for Hashem to tell me what is the meaning of people who die. What is the, like, I need to make meaning of my life. I need to say, right? So in terms of COVID, right, to learn that we are all connected, to learn that, right, that I don't wear mask for you. I don't wear mask for me. I wear a mask for you. And I don't turn to God to justify or to look at things, right, that are man-made. We are the masters of what we do, and therefore we have to fix it. It is my responsibility as a rabbi, as a person, as a Jew, whatever, to actually do better at creating a community that understands both its successes and its failures. Tim, you had your hand, and then I saw Rob.
Yeah, I guess. So you're talking a lot about like being able to be vulnerable with each other. And I think it also, as I'm a psychotherapist and I'm sort of Jungian leading, so I'm loving all of this talk about the shadow. And also internal family systems, which is a lot of like inner child work. And so the idea, like in order to be vulnerable with each other, we first have to be able to turn towards ourselves and towards our own wounds, and to be able to hold our own wounds with that same kind of sort of loving kindness, right? That we're looking for God and for others. Like so much of addiction is about, addiction is a disease that's about a lack of connection, but that connection can also be internal. And and so much of it is, I just wanted to say, like, is being able to turn, even though we might be too, like, in some ways, addiction and like our addicted parts are trying to help us, but in ways that aren't helping us, by keeping us from feeling something or not feeling something, because they don't think that we can handle it, because we never learned like how to as a child. But now that we're adults, we have the ability to reparent ourselves and be kind and compassionate to those parts of us that are really wounded and broken. And I think, and that's where sort of, and to give ourselves sort of that godly energy, so that we can sort of not only just look outside of ourselves for the connection, but be able to speak from a vulnerable place because we are connected to it, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And again, we have 1 minute, right? Right, 1 minute. And I would say that our ability to find meaning in why we were trying to mask the things we're feeling is exactly the question of that brokenness, that we somehow felt that we are not worth it, that somehow that when God made us, he made trash, that somehow we don't deserve good things, that somehow we don't deserve what we have, and we'll never deserve what we have. Though that sense, right, and I'll end with that sort of the message is, no, you matter. And the essence of healing starts with like, I matter. Why? Because God made me. And because I live today, I have value. And if I have value, everything else stems from that. And if I try and find you somewhere else or mask it, I won't be able to find it.